The radio on the kitchen counter was not supposed to be there. Everyone at the table pretended not to see it. Her mother passed the bread without looking at it. Her younger brother poured juice and kept his eyes on the glass. Her father told a story about something that happened at work 3 weeks ago. The kind of story families tell when they need noise to fill a room. And Carol listened, smiled at the right moments, and kept one eye on the radio the way a person keeps one eye on a door they are not sure is locked. She had been a search and rescue responder for 6 years. She had gone out in blizzards. She had crawled into ravines in the dark. She had held a woman's hand for 4 hours in a collapsed structure, while waiting for equipment that was slow to arrive. She had done all of this without complaining, without asking for recognition, and without once thinking that any of it was more than what the job required. The job required everything. She gave it everything. That was the agreement she had made with herself long before she signed any paperwork. 2 days ago, her team commander, a careful man named Gary, had called her into his office. The office smelled like old coffee, and the kind of carpet that absorbs years of stress and never gives it back. Gary had sat across from her with his hands flat on the desk, the way he always sat when he was about to say something he had already rehearsed. He told her she was being rotated off the active mission roster for the Christmas period. She had waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. Gary explained that the team had been running hard for 11 weeks straight, 3 major operations, 2 of them in brutal conditions. Protocol suggested that responders cycle through mandatory rest periods, and Carol had not taken one in longer than the log could easily account for. The holiday window was the right time. The team that was stepping in was capable. The active caseload was manageable. She would be back on rotation the morning of the 27th. Carol had nodded. She had said thank you. She had walked to her car in the parking lot, sat in the driver's seat for a moment, and then driven home. That was 2 days ago. Now it was Christmas Eve, and the radio sat on the counter, and her family told stories around it like it was a centerpiece nobody had chosen on purpose. What nobody at the table said, because families rarely say the exact true thing, was that Carol had not been the same since she joined the unit. That not worse, not broken, just different in the way that certain people become different when they find the work they were built for. Before search and rescue, Carol had been kind and competent, and quietly restless in the way of people who have not yet met the version of themselves that makes sense. After 6 years on the unit, the restlessness was gone. In its place was something steadier, a kind of focus that other people sometimes mistook for distance, but was really the opposite. She was more present than almost anyone her family knew. She just happened to be most present at 3 in the morning on a mountainside, with someone's life in the balance. Her mother asked if she wanted more potatoes. Carol said yes. Her brother made a joke. Her father laughed. The radio was quiet. She had been told to rest. She understood, in the part of her mind that processed logic clearly, that Gary was not wrong. 11 weeks was a long run. Her body carried the evidence of it in small ways that she had stopped cataloging because cataloging them felt like complaint. There was a tiredness behind her eyes that good sleep had not fully solved. There was a tension in her shoulders that she stretched out each morning and that returned by noon. She knew what rest was supposed to look like. She knew it was reasonable. She also knew that reasonable and right were not always the same thing, and that the particular difficulty of mandatory rest was not the resting, but the waiting. Waiting was the hardest part of any rescue. Not the darkness, not the cold, not the physical demand. The waiting, the minutes between receiving a call and arriving on scene. The hours spent searching ground that gave nothing back. The stillness of not knowing. Carol could manage almost any physical challenge the job threw at her. The stillness was the thing that cost her the most. And now she had been handed a holiday's worth of it. She cleared the dinner plates while her mother cut the pie, when her brother had fallen asleep on the couch, which was a tradition he had maintained since childhood, and showed no signs of breaking. Her father sat in his armchair and flipped through a magazine without reading it. The house was warm. The lights on the tree were the old kind, slightly uneven, the ones her mother had refused to replace because they had been on every tree Carol could remember. Outside, the night was cold and clear and very still. Carol stood at the kitchen sink and washed a dish and thought about the briefing she had not attended that morning. The active case on the unit's board was a missing hiker, a man in his mid-40s named Alan, who had gone out 3 days ago on a trail in the eastern range and had not come back. The trail was not a difficult one under normal conditions. The conditions had not been normal. A weather front had moved in faster than predicted, dropping temperatures and reducing visibility, and Alan had missed his check-in window twice. His wife had reported him missing on the evening of the 22nd. The team had been working the case since then. Carol knew the Eastern Range well. She had been on 2 previous operations in that area. She knew where the trail split in a way that was easy to miss when the light was bad. She knew where the ground dropped unexpectedly on the northern side. She knew a dozen things about that particular stretch of land that would not appear in any official file, because they were the kind of knowledge that only accumulates through time and presence. And she was standing at a kitchen sink washing a dish while her team worked without her. She set the dish in the rack and dried her hands. Her mother came in to put the kettle on, and they stood together for a moment in the way that mothers and daughters stand when there is something between them that does not need to be spoken. Carol's mother had never asked her to quit the unit. She had never suggested that the job was too much, too dangerous, too consuming. She had made peace with what her daughter was, in the quiet way of people who love someone enough to let that person be completely themselves. What she had done, in the years since Carol joined the unit, was learn to read the radio the same way Carol did, to note when it was silent, to note when it was not. The kettle began to heat. Carol's mother said, "You could sleep." Carol said, "I know." The team knows what they're doing. They do. Her mother nodded, and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that would touch the real thing. The real thing was not worry. Carol was not worried about her team. The real thing was simpler and harder to name. It was the feeling of being the exact right instrument for a particular task, and being set aside anyway. It was the feeling of a person trained for emergencies, standing in a kitchen, during an emergency that was happening without her. She thought about the first operation she had ever gone on, the one that had told her, without ambiguity, that this was the work she was built for. It had been a routine training exercise, technically, a simulated search on a familiar trail with a volunteer playing the missing subject. Carol had been new enough that the team lead had paired her with an experienced responder named Gwen, a woman who moved through difficult terrain with the particular efficiency of someone who had made it her native language. Carol had followed Gwen and watched how she read the ground, how she made decisions without announcing them, how she adjusted her route based on information that Carol was still learning to collect. They had found the volunteer in 4 hours, which was fast for the conditions. Gwen had said almost nothing about the result. She had said, when they were driving back, one thing: "You have the instinct, now you need the knowledge. The instinct is the thing you can't teach. The knowledge is the thing you have to earn." Carol had thought about this for weeks after. She had made it a kind of organizing principle for the years that followed. Every operation was knowledge earning. Every briefing was knowledge earning. Every hour in the field, including the hours that found nothing, were knowledge earning, in a way that did not announce itself until the moment it became relevant. Tonight was a moment when it had become relevant. She made the tea. She carried it into the living room. She sat in the chair near the window. Outside, through the glass, she could see the dark edge of the hill behind her parents' house, and above it the stars, and she could not stop herself from thinking that somewhere beyond that hill, beyond the next range and the next, a man named Alan was out in the cold, and had been out in the cold for 3 days, and that the window for finding a person alive in those conditions did not stay open forever. The radio on the counter stayed quiet. She drank her tea. She let the warmth of the house settle around her. Her brother snored softly on the couch. Her father turned a page. Her mother hummed something in the kitchen that Carol could almost but not quite identify. The tree lights blinked in their slightly uneven way. The clock on the wall moved forward in small, even steps. Carol closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she stayed still, and she let the quiet be what it was. She thought about what Gary had said about the team. She thought about Alan's wife, who had made a phone call on the 22nd, and was now somewhere in her own house, going through her own version of a holiday that had become a waiting room. She thought about the Eastern Range, and the place where the trail split, and the way the northern drop came up faster than you expected in the dark. She thought, they will find him. She thought, I hope they find him. The radio was quiet. For now, the radio was quiet. She stayed in the chair by the window, and held her cup, and watched the dark outside the glass, and let herself be, For a little while, just a person in a warm house on Christmas Eve. Just Carol. Not the responder, not the unit member, not the person with 6 years of difficult terrain in her body. The just Carol. In the house she grew up in, with the family she loved. It was harder than any mountain she had climbed, but she stayed in the chair. The clock moved. The lights blinked. The radio sat on the counter in the kitchen, exactly where she had put it when she walked in. And the night went on. The hours after midnight moved differently than any other hours. Carol had learned this on her first real overnight operation, 4 years ago, when she had been new enough to be surprised by it. Daytime hours had weight to them, substance, the sense of moving through something real and visible. The hours between midnight and 4 in the morning were thinner. They had a suspended quality, like the pause between one breath and the next, like a held note that could not decide when to end. Everything became more precise in those hours. Sounds carried further. Silence was louder. The mind, stripped of its daytime noise, arrived at a particular kind of clarity that was equal parts useful and uncomfortable. Carol had been sitting in the chair by the window for a long time when the house finally settled into full quiet. Her father had gone to bed at 11. Her brother had woken from his couch nap, relocated to the guest room, and fallen back asleep with a speed that Carol had always privately found remarkable. Her mother had come to the living room doorway at 11:30, looked at Carol for a moment with the particular expression that meant, "I am not going to tell you what to do, but I want you to know. I see you," and then said goodnight and gone to bed. Carol had said goodnight back. She had stayed in the chair. The house around her was the house she had grown up in, and it had a specific vocabulary of sounds that she had been reading since childhood. The furnace kicked on with a low hum. The refrigerator cycled through a brief rattle and then steadied. A branch somewhere outside moved against the side of the house, in a way it had moved for as long as she could remember, like a slow, irregular knock that had never once meant anything but still arrived on its own schedule. She knew all of these sounds the way you know the breathing of someone you have slept near for a long time. They were the sounds of a place that was hers, and she was grateful for them, and she could not quite settle into them. On the unit, Christmas Eve was not a holiday. It was a date on a calendar that the mountains and the rivers and the people who got lost in them did not observe. Carol had worked Christmas Eve twice in her 6 years. Both times had been unremarkable in the way that most operations were unremarkable, which was to say they were hard and cold and required complete attention, and ended with a person found and a team driving back in the dark, quietly, the way you are quiet after something has been resolved that could have gone the other way. She had not minded working those holidays. She had minded, slightly, the particular look on her family's faces when she called to explain why she would not make it. Not a look of disappointment exactly, more a look of careful acceptance, the kind that takes some effort to arrange. She had filed that look away and carried it with her, in the abstract way you carry things that matter and that you cannot change. Now she was here, at home, with nowhere to be, and the absence of necessity had a physical quality she had not expected. Sat in her chest, like a held breath. Not pain, not quite, something more like the feeling of a word you cannot remember, hovering just behind the reach of your mind, present but unavailable. She got up from the chair at 1:10 and went to the kitchen. The radio was there. She did not touch it. She stood near the counter and looked at it and reminded herself that the protocol was correct, that Gary's decision was not a judgment of her ability, but a response to 11 weeks of continuous demand, that rest was a real thing with real value, and that ignoring it for long enough eventually made people slower and worse in the field, which was the opposite of what any of them were trying to be. She stood there for a moment longer, then filled a glass with water and drank it and went back to the living room. She had brought a book with her from the city, something she had meant to read for months, a story about a man who sailed alone across a large body of water and the things he thought about during the crossing. She had read 11 pages of it in the 2 days since she arrived. She picked it up now and opened it to the 12th page, and read 2 paragraphs and found that the words were going in but not connecting to anything, sliding past each other like ice on glass. She put the book down. She thought about Alan. Alan's wife had told the dispatcher that he was an experienced hiker, which was a phrase that carried different meanings depending on who said it about whom. In Carol's experience, Experienced hiker meant anything from someone who had completed a dozen serious alpine routes to someone who had hiked the same well-marked trail enough times that they stopped treating it with attention. The Eastern Range Trail that Alan had taken was not a place that rewarded inattention, especially in December, especially when the weather was shifting. It was a trail that looked manageable from the trailhead and became something else entirely once you were half a mile in, and the light had changed, and the path markers were covered by a fresh fall of snow that came down with no warning, and stayed. Carol had stood at that split in the trail twice. She had stood there in daylight, with good visibility, with the right gear, with a partner beside her, and even then there was a moment when the correct direction required thought. At night, in a weather front, alone, with 3 days behind you and your body running on less than it needed, that split could take a person somewhere there was no easy path back from. She wanted to be there. She wanted to be walking that trail right now, with her headlamp and her pack, and the particular focused stillness that came over her in the field. The stillness that was not calm so much as complete attention. Every sense and thought and physical ability oriented toward a single task. No noise, no distraction, no waiting. Only the work, only the ground ahead and the purpose behind every step. Instead, she was in her parents' living room at 1:20 in the morning, listening to a branch knock against the side of the house. She picked the book up again and tried the 12th page a second time. She made it through 3 paragraphs before she found herself reading the same sentence for the 4th time without hearing it. She set the book on the table beside her chair and left it there. Outside, the temperature had dropped further. She could feel it through the window glass even from where she sat. The cold radiating off the surface in a way that was invisible but present. The way winter asserts itself through any barrier eventually. Somewhere in the Eastern Range, that cold was not a draft through a window. It was the full weight of winter with nothing between it and a person's skin, except whatever that person had thought to put on 3 days ago, when the forecast had looked different, and the plan had seemed reasonable, and everything had seemed manageable. 3 days. She knew the math. She did not want to think about the math, but she knew it. The same way she knew a dozen other sets of numbers that lived in her body now and came up when she did not invite them. The human body in serious cold was not a tragedy that arrived all at once. It was a conversation that the cold had with your body over time, wearing down one response and then the next, patient and methodical, and utterly without interest in the outcome. 3 days was a long conversation. It did not mean the conversation was over. People had survived longer. She had helped find people who had survived longer. But it meant the window was not wide, and every hour made it narrower in a way that did not pause for rest schedules or holiday rotations, or the entirely reasonable logic of a commander sitting across a desk with his hands flat on the surface. She thought about what it felt like, the specific texture of a night that would not release you into sleep. She had read somewhere, years ago, that first responders who worked repeated high-intensity operations often developed a kind of chronic readiness, a physiological state that kept the body oriented toward potential demand even during rest periods. She had read this as a description of a problem. She had thought about it since, and decided it was a description of a condition, which was different. A problem was something you solved or corrected. A condition was something you understood and managed. She was not broken by the readiness. She had built her life around it, and the life worked. What the readiness did not do was make a chair by a window at 2 in the morning, an easy place to sit, with nothing required of her. It made the chair a kind of test. She could see that clearly now, in the way you see things clearly at that hour, without the softening that daytime usually provided. The test was not about whether she could rest. The test was about whether she trusted the people she worked with enough to let them do the work without her. She did trust them. She knew she did. The trust sat in her chest like a real thing, solid and earned. It coexisted, without resolution, with the thing that also sat in her chest. The thing that was not distrust but was something adjacent to insufficiency. The feeling of being necessary and unavailable at the same time. Carol set her hands in her lap and looked at the radio through the kitchen doorway. It was quiet. It had been quiet all night. She told herself this was good. Quiet meant the team was working. Quiet meant no one needed anything that required a general call. Quiet meant the situation was contained, moving through its process. She thought about who was on the overnight shift, and she thought about the ground conditions and the updated weather report she had looked at once before leaving the city, and then put away, because looking at it again would not help anything, and she had known that. She thought about the trail split, and the northern drop, and the way the terrain on the far side of the eastern ridge changed character when you crossed it, going from open to closed, from passable to demanding, with a speed that caught people off guard even when they were paying attention. She thought, they know to check the northern side. She thought, I hope they check the northern side. She got up from the chair again. She did not go to the kitchen this time. She went to the window and stood close enough to the glass that she could feel the cold coming off it on her face. And she looked out at the dark hill and the sky above it. The stars were very clear. No cloud cover, which meant the temperature was still dropping, which meant the cold in the eastern range was still deepening, which meant the window she had been thinking about for the last 3 hours was continuing to move in the direction that it always moved, without any input from anyone. She breathed on the glass and watched it fog and clear. She went back to the chair. She sat. At some point she fell into a shallow, restless version of sleep that was less sleep than the body's refusal to stay awake any longer. She did not dream, or if she did, the dreams dissolved before she could register them. She surfaced once and checked the clock. It was 2:17. She settled back. 2:38. She was not rested. She was not unrested. She was suspended in the particular physical state of someone whose mind would not stop, and whose body could not keep up with it. At 2:42 she opened her eyes and did not close them again. She stood up. She stretched her back. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and looked at the dark outside the kitchen window, where the hill was a black mass against a sky that was beginning to change at its lowest edge, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of east. Not light yet, just slightly less dark. The first sign of the day deciding it was going to arrive. She filled the kettle. She set it on the burner. She stood there. The radio sat 2 feet from her left hand. She was not thinking about touching it. She was not planning to touch it. She was standing in her mother's kitchen at 2:42 in the morning, waiting for a kettle to heat, and thinking about a man on a mountain, and the specific narrowing window of his survival, and the drainage she had found by accident 2 years ago, and never written up properly, and the birch trees at the trail entry that would be visible even in the dark, because birch bark caught light in a way that other trees did not. The kettle had not yet reached a boil. The radio made its sound. Not loud, not dramatic. The alert tone was a practical sound, the kind designed to be heard over wind and weather, and the noise of people moving fast. And in the silence of the kitchen at 2:42 in the morning, it seemed almost ordinary in how functional it was. 2 short tones, a pause, then the dispatcher's voice, flat and measured, the voice that did not change its register, regardless of what it was carrying, because a voice that stayed level was a voice that could be heard clearly by someone in the field who did not have room for confusion. Dispatch was asking for any available member of the Eastern Range Unit. Not a specific name, not a specific rank, available. Carol's hand was on the radio before the sentence finished. She pressed the button. She said her name and her unit number, and she said she was available. There was a half-second of static that contained the full weight of the shift she had just made. Then the dispatcher came back with coordinates and conditions, and Carol stood at the counter and listened with the part of her mind that recorded, and the part that was already moving through the terrain in her head simultaneously, mapping what she was hearing onto what she knew. The team on the Eastern Range had located a possible signal, faint, consistent with a personal locator beacon on low battery. The terrain at the signal point was difficult to access from the team's current position, due to ice accumulation on an exposed traverse. They needed someone who knew the northern approach of the Eastern Trail. The weather window was narrow. They needed someone now. Carol was already moving toward her gear before the dispatcher finished the sentence. She had packed her gear when she came home for the holiday. She had told herself at the time that this was just habit, that her gear went where she went, the way her keys went where she went, automatically, without plan or specific intention. This was partly true. It was also true that she had stood in her apartment on the 23rd before driving to her parents' house, and had looked at the pack in the corner, and had made a decision that she did not name out loud, because naming it would have required acknowledging what it assumed. She had packed it. She had put it in the car. She had told herself it was just how she traveled. Now she was pulling it out of the closet by the front door, and the truth of the decision she had not named on the 23rd was standing right there in front of her, and she had no interest in examining it. She had somewhere to be. Her base layer first. She pulled it on in the kitchen doorway, moving fast and quiet, not thinking about the cold or the drive or the 40-odd minutes of mountain terrain between her and the coordinates dispatch had given her. She was thinking about the trail split. She was thinking about the northern approach, and the drainage entry, and the birch trees, and the signal location on the device screen she had already read twice, to lock the coordinates into her memory, alongside the map she was building in her head. Her mid-layer, her shell. She moved through the kit with the efficiency of someone who has done this in the dark, half asleep, in conditions that did not allow for delay, enough times that the sequence lived in her body rather than her mind. She did not have to think about what came next. Her hands knew. Her jacket, her pack, her headlamp off the kitchen counter, where she had set it 2 days ago, because that was where she always put it, within reach, within sight. Her phone into the chest pocket of her shell, her keys off the hook by the door. She was pulling on her boots when she heard her mother in the hallway. Her mother's voice was soft and awake, in a way that was not surprised. "They called?" Carol looked up from her boot. Her mother was standing in the hallway in her robe, her hair flat on one side from the chair she had been sleeping in, which told Carol that her mother had not actually gone to bed, but had sat in the armchair in her room, the way Carol had sat in the armchair in the living room, listening to a house breathe, and waiting for whatever the night was going to bring. "They called," Carol said. Her mother came forward. She reached out and straightened the collar of Carol's jacket. It was a small gesture, the kind that had no practical purpose, and every emotional one. The gesture of a person who needs a moment of contact before something begins. Carol had been on the receiving end of that gesture since she was small enough for it to involve reaching down. She stood still for it. "Go," her mother said. Carol went. The door closed behind her. The cold arrived in a clean wave that she recognized the way you recognize something you have stepped into hundreds of times. Not unpleasant. Not pleasant. Simply the temperature of the work. She threw her pack in the back of the car. She started the engine. The clock on the dashboard read 2:47. She pulled out of the driveway and onto the empty road, and the lights of the neighborhood fell away behind her, and then there was just the road and the dark and the columns of her headlights cutting ahead. The valley road east of her parents' house was 2 lanes, straight. Nothing on it at this hour but Carol and the night. She drove at the upper edge of what was safe for the conditions. Not reckless, not slow, the kind of speed that comes from knowing a road and knowing why you need to be somewhere, and having done the internal math on the acceptable margin. The radio in the center console brought the dispatcher's voice in pieces as she moved through the valley, coordinates and updates and a temperature reading from the signal location that she noted, and filed away in the column of numbers she was maintaining in the back of her mind. The locator beacon was still active, still faint but still transmitting. This was the most important piece of information she had received tonight, and she held it at the front of her attention as she drove. A beacon that was still transmitting after 3 days in those conditions meant someone had been careful with it. You did not get 3 days of signal from a standard personal locator device, unless you managed the battery deliberately. You turned it on for specific windows, and you turned it off in between, and you tracked the time, and you made decisions about when the risk of being unfound outweighed the risk of running out of power. This required thought. This required planning. This was not the behavior of someone who had given up. Carol drove faster. The active road branched off the valley road 20 minutes from her parents' house, climbing in switchbacks up toward the base of the eastern range. The surface changed under her tires from smooth asphalt to the rougher, patched texture of a mountain access road, and she adjusted her speed accordingly and kept her attention on the surface and the edges of the road where the shoulder dropped away into dark. She had driven this road before, during training exercises and during 2 previous operations in this area. She knew its character. She did not take it lightly. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read -11. She noted it, and noted it once, and did not note it again. It was the number it was she had dressed for worse. The trailhead was a pull-off on the right side of the access road, a gravel area barely wide enough for 3 vehicles, marked by a wooden sign that the snow had partially covered. Xonge, TUAC, Carol pulled in and killed the engine. The silence that replaced the engine noise was absolute in the way that mountain silence was absolute. The kind with actual depth to it. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a large space with nothing moving in it. She sat in it for a moment and let her ears adjust. Then she heard what was actually present. The wind in the upper tree line. A creak of something settling in the cold somewhere above her. Her own breathing. She got out of the car. The cold was different up here than it had been in the valley, or at her parents' house. It was not the cold that negotiated with you. It was the cold that simply was, without apology and without any particular interest in your opinion of it. She registered it, and moved through it to the back of the car, where she checked her pack one more time against habit rather than doubt. Headlamp working. Navigation device charged and with the coordinates loaded. First aid kit in its designated pocket. 2 thermal blankets in the outer pocket. Not one, because she had made that decision when she packed and she was glad of it now. Emergency shelter material in the main compartment. Water. 2 extra hand warmers beyond the standard kit. A section of rope. A folding probe. Her radio on her shoulder. She clicked on her headlamp and started up the main trail. The trail from the trailhead was well compacted, the surface pressed down by whatever traffic it had seen before the weather changed, and she moved quickly on it, her headlamp throwing its circle of light ahead of her, and the dark pressing in on either side. The cold settled into the rhythm of the climb, and became background rather than event. She breathed steadily. She kept her pace at the rate she could sustain for an extended period. She watched the ground and the tree line and the sky above the ridge, and she listened. The radio at her shoulder carried dispatch and Pete, who had called in from the trailhead behind her, arriving in his own vehicle 12 minutes after Carol. Pete was on the unit 4 years in. Carol had worked with him on 5 or 6 operations, and she knew him to be the kind of responder who was quiet in the field and competent in a way that did not require demonstration. She acknowledged his check-in and told him her position and that she was approaching the drainage entry. She told him to follow her track once she confirmed the route was clear. Diane was the 3rd responder, coming from the opposite direction, an additional 20 minutes out. Carol noted this and adjusted her mental map. She would be first on scene by a margin. This was fine. She had been first on scene before, and she knew what it required, which was to arrive without having spent everything on the approach, which was why she was managing her pace the way she was managing it even now, even with the numbers in her head, and the window, and the 3 days behind her that she could not stop thinking about. She covered the first kilometer in just under 12 minutes. She turned off the main trail at the marker she had held in memory for 2 years. 3 birch trees on the left side of the path where the main trail curved right. She had counted on birch being visible in the dark, and it was. The pale bark caught her headlamp at 30 meters, and resolved into the specific grouping she remembered. The largest tree slightly ahead of the other 2. The entry between the first and second trees barely suggesting itself in the snow and the dark. She turned left between them and started down into the drainage. The drainage was everything she had remembered, sheltered from the wind that had been constant on the main trail. The snow on the ground was soft and gave her traction rather than slipping under her. She moved down through it carefully, one hand sometimes touching the bank on her right for balance, her headlamp sweeping the ground in steady arcs, looking for anything that was not what it appeared to be. She had a way of moving through difficult terrain at night that she had never been able to fully explain to anyone who had not experienced it themselves. It was not exactly vision, because vision was the least reliable thing you had, once the dark was full enough. It was something closer to the accumulation of small inputs, the pressure of the ground through her boots, the slight give or resistance of each footfall, telling her what the surface was before her eyes confirmed it. The cold on her face, telling her where the wind was coming from, and therefore where the exposed ground would be. You built a picture from everything that was not the thing you were looking at, and you moved through that picture with a confidence that came from having built many pictures in many conditions and having learned how accurate they could be. She radioed her position and confirmed the northern approach was passable. Dispatch acknowledged. The beacon signal, dispatch relayed, was still active. The coordinates had a small update. The signal had shifted slightly, either device movement or terrain bounce. Carol noted both possibilities and kept moving. At the bottom of the drainage, the ground leveled into a narrow shelf, with rock on one side and a falling slope on the other. Carol stopped and checked her navigation, comparing the coordinates on her device with the terrain in front of her. The signal source was northeast, perhaps 300 meters, up a moderate slope through open tree cover that she could see the edge of in the reach of her headlamp. She started up. The trees were old and widely spaced, their lower branches bare, their trunks dark against her light. The ground between them was broken by hidden rocks and root systems buried under snow, and she watched her footing with the full attention the surface required. This was the part of a search that was less dramatic than it sounded from the outside. It was not a sprint. It was not a charge. It was deliberate and careful forward movement through terrain that did not want to be moved through quickly, conducted at the maximum speed that safety allowed, which was slower than urgency wanted and faster than caution suggested, and the experienced responder lived permanently in that gap and learned to be comfortable there. Carol was very experienced. She moved up through the trees, and she was comfortable in the gap. Her device in her left hand, her right hand free. She checked coordinates every 20 meters. The signal was strengthening with every check, and this was the best information she had had since she left the car. A strengthening signal meant convergence. A source that was still transmitting after 3 days meant someone who was still fighting. She thought, someone careful with their equipment is someone who is still thinking clearly enough to be careful. She thought, that is everything right now. She thought about the last time she had been on a search that went past day 2. It had been 2 years ago, a summer operation. A teenager who had gone off trail in a different range with a group of friends and became separated when the weather came in. The search had run into its 3rd day before they found her, alive, sheltered under a rock overhang near a creek. Carol had been one of the 4 who made the find. She remembered the girl's face in the first moment of the headlamp, the way fear and relief arrived at exactly the same moment, together, the way they looked on a person's face like something you could not have predicted or prepared for, but that you recognized immediately when you saw it. What she also remembered was the briefing on the morning of that 3rd day. The team lead, a man named Felix who had been running operations for 15 years, had said nothing dramatic about the timeline or the odds. He had simply said, "She made it through 2 nights. A person who makes it through 2 nights is a person who found something to hold on to. Our job is to find that person before they run out of holding on." Carol had thought about that sentence many times since, not because it was complicated, but because it was the most accurate description she had ever heard of what the 3rd day of a search actually was. Not a reckoning, not a final edge, a test of whether the person out there had found their something, and whether the team could find them in time. Alan had found his something. The evidence was in the beacon. 6 operational windows across 3 days, 2 hours each, turned off between to save the battery, turned on at the last rational moment, when the risk of being unfound outweighed the risk of running out of power. This was planning. This was a person who had been cold and in pain and alone in the dark, and had refused to let those facts override the thinking part of his mind. That kind of refusal was not ordinary. Carol had seen it before, and it never stopped meaning the same thing. Someone out there was still fighting the conversation. Her job was to get to him before the conversation ended. The trees thinned as the slope steepened, and she came out onto open ground below a rock shelf that jutted from the hillside. Her device beeped in her hand. The signal was almost directly above her, on the shelf, no more than 30 meters. She stopped. She took a breath. She called out, using Alan's name clearly and calmly, the way you called in the field when you wanted to be heard without startling someone who was already at the edge of their resources. 4 seconds of silence. Then something moved on the rock above her. A small sound, the sound of snow shifting under the weight of a person adjusting their position. And then a voice, a thin and rough, and shaped by 3 days of cold and effort and waiting. But a voice, present and directed and real. "Here," it said, "I'm here." Carol was already moving to the face of the shelf, finding the ledges, testing each one before committing, moving up quickly and without wasted motion. She came over the top and her headlamp found him in the first sweep, and she covered the distance between them in 8 steps. Alan was sitting in a shallow depression in the rock face, a natural hollow that had given him partial shelter from the wind and the worst of the temperature. He had his pack open in his lap. He was holding the locator device in both hands. His face was pale and rough with cold, his lips dry, his eyes carrying the particular quality of a body that had been running a serious deficit for a long time, but his eyes were tracking her headlamp. They were following movement. They were present and aware. She crouched in front of him. "Helen," she said, "I'm Carol. I'm with Search and Rescue. You are found." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the precise economy of a man who had been rationing everything including words, "Took you a while." She did not laugh. She wanted to, and she might have, in a different moment, because it was the kind of line that a person said when they were still themselves enough to reach for something that was not fear or relief, or the purely physical relief of not dying alone. It meant he was more present than his appearance suggested. She filed it and moved. Her hands went through the assessment with the speed of something repeated enough times to live in muscle memory rather than thought. Temperature, skin color, responsiveness. She asked him questions and he answered them. Slowly, with effort, but he answered them correctly and in sequence. And this told her more than any single answer. She checked his hands. 3 fingers on his right hand showed the particular blanched and waxy look of mild frostbite. The early stage. Not the stage that took things from a person permanently. She checked his left leg, which he had mentioned on the second day, a fall on a downslope that had made walking increasingly difficult, and then stopped being viable as the terrain changed and the cold deepened. The leg was bruised from mid-thigh to the knee, the bruise old enough to have moved through its early stages, still painful to the touch but not suggesting a fracture when she ran her hands along the bone carefully. And he was dehydrated. He was cold. He had mild frostbite on 3 fingers and a significant impact bruise on his leg. And he had been sitting on a rock shelf in the eastern range for roughly 36 hours. After the leg made further movement, more risk than reward. And he had managed all of this with a clarity and a deliberateness that she found herself noting with something that was not quite admiration, because admiration implied surprise, and she was not surprised. People were capable of extraordinary things when they decided that giving up was not one of the available options. She had seen this enough times to stop being surprised by it. She was still moved by it every time. For she pulled the thermal blanket from her outer pocket and wrapped it around him, moving efficiently but not roughly, adjusting it so it covered his shoulders and most of his legs. She handed him the water from her pack and said, "Drink slowly." And he drank slowly. She watched his hands on the bottle. They were shaking slightly, the fine motor tremor of a body that was cold all the way through and had been for a long time, but his grip was adequate. He could hold the bottle. She radioed dispatch. She said, "Subject located, eastern shelf above the northern drainage, conscious and coherent, vital signs reduced but stable, requesting extraction support at the base of the northern drainage approach." She gave the grid reference. She gave the condition summary. She kept it short, because short was what dispatch needed, and what Pete and Diane needed when they heard it. Dispatch acknowledged. Pete's voice came through a moment later. He and Diane were at the drainage entry. They were moving up. Carol sat down beside Alan on the rock shelf and kept her shoulder against his, so her body warmth was a factor in his, and she waited for Pete's headlamp to appear at the tree line below them. Alan drank the water in careful sips. The thermal blanket crinkled around his shoulders when he moved. The night was very still up here on the shelf. The wind that had been in the valley and on the lower slopes, absent at this elevation behind the rock face, and the only sounds were their breathing, and the occasional small creak of the cold, working at the rock around them. Alan said, after a while, "How did you find this approach?" Carol said, "Found it by accident 2 years ago. Went off trail looking for something else, and came back through the drainage. Remembered the birch trees at the entry." He thought about this. "And tonight you knew to come that way." "The team's regular approach was blocked. I knew this one was clear." He looked out at the dark below the shelf. "Lucky," he said. Carol considered this. It was not wrong, exactly. The way most things that were almost right were not exactly wrong. But it was not the complete truth either, and she found herself wanting to say the complete truth, not because she needed him to understand the distinction, but because the distinction mattered to her in a way she had never quite put into words before tonight. She said, "Luck is finding the drainage by accident. Knowledge is remembering it. And being here tonight is being the person who both found it and remembered it, which is not luck anymore. That's just what the work builds in you over time. You can't always know which piece of it you're going to need." Alan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 6 years is a long time. Carol said, it goes fast. He turned the locator device over in his hands, slowly, looking at it. I rationed it, he said. 2-hour windows, twice a day. I figured if I could keep it going until the 4th day, someone would find the route. You figured correctly. I figured it was the only option worth calculating for. She looked at him. The headlamp threw its light across the shelf and across his face, and in the light he looked like what he was. A man in his mid-40s, who had spent 3 days on a mountain, with a damaged leg, and a careful mind, and a very specific refusal to become a different kind of statistic than the one his wife had been hoping for. She thought about his wife, who was somewhere in a house right now, in her own version of the long night, and who was about to receive a call that would change the weight of the entire world. She picked up her radio and asked dispatch to notify next of kin that the subject had been located and was alive and stable. Dispatch said it was already in progress. Carol said to Alan, "Your wife knows." He closed his eyes, just for a moment. Then he opened them and looked out at the dark and the stars above the shelf, and he did not say anything for a while, and Carol did not say anything either, and they sat together on the rock and let the thermal blanket do its work, and waited for the headlamps to appear at the tree line. Pete's light came first, then Diane's, the two of them moving up through the trees in the deliberate, careful way of experienced people on difficult ground at night. Carol watched them come. She felt the particular settling that happened in the field when the team came together, when the solitary advance work resolved into the collective effort that could actually carry a person out of a place like this. She had felt it before, and it never stopped feeling like exactly what it was. Pete and Diane came up over the shelf edge, and Diane began her own assessment, while Pete assembled the extraction sled, the lightweight frame breaking apart from its carry position and locking into its operational shape with practice speed. Diane confirmed Carol's assessment, made one small addition about Alan's hydration level that she communicated to Carol in the efficient shorthand of people who had worked together in the field, and then they began the process of moving Alan from where he was to where they needed him to be. Carol sat beside Alan while Diane finished the assessment, and she looked out at the dark below the shelf, and she thought about Gary's office and the way the conversation had ended 2 days ago, with her saying thank you and meaning it, and also carrying something that was not quite resentment, but lived in the same neighborhood. She had not wanted Gary to be wrong. She had simply wanted the rotation to be different, to be the kind of rest that happened between operations, rather than the kind that happened during one, when someone she might have found was out in the cold being found more slowly than she could have found them. She had not expressed this at the time. She had thanked Gary, and walked to her car, and driven home, and sat in the chair by the window for 2 nights, with the radio on the kitchen counter. She was not in the habit of holding things against people who were doing their jobs correctly, with the information they had. Gary had done his job correctly. The information he had on the 23rd had not included tonight, which was not Gary's fault, and was not something anyone could have known or accounted for. What tonight gave her was not a counter-argument to Gary's decision. It gave her something smaller and more personal than that. It gave her the specific knowledge that the thing she was, the responder she had become across 6 years, and dozens of operations and one accidentally discovered drainage approach, had been exactly what tonight needed. Not a better version. Not a more rested version. Exactly this version, with exactly these 6 years behind her, on exactly this road at exactly 2:47 in the morning. She had been the right person in the right place because of who she was, and who she was had been built by every operation and every night in the field, and every detail she had filed away without knowing which one would matter. That was the accumulation the work produced, not a credential, not a title, a specific and particular capability that could not be transferred or assumed or produced in any way other than the slow and unglamorous way it had actually been produced. Alan finished the water. He handed the bottle back without being asked. She took it and tucked it into her pack. He said, as they got him settled on the sled, "I feel embarrassed about this." Pete said, without looking up from the sled clips he was checking, "Don't." Carol said, "You managed 3 days in conditions that would have ended a lot of people in one. You maintained your beacon. You found shelter. You made correct decisions. There is nothing to feel embarrassed about." Alan looked at her. "You really mean that?" I really mean that. The descent through the drainage was careful and slow in the way that descents with an injured person on a sled were always careful and slow. Pete and Diane managed the sled between them, calling the terrain to each other in the abbreviated language of people who had done this work long enough to need very few words for it. Carol carried Alan's pack and stayed close, watching the ground ahead and the terrain to either side and the body on the sled for any sign that the movement was too much too fast. It was not. Alan's color was improving. His responses to Carol's periodic check-in questions were getting sharper, the glassiness leaving his eyes as the blanket and the movement and the water did their slow, reliable work. He was not out of the situation yet. Hypothermia was not a door that opened and closed in a single moment. It was a condition that required proper medical management and monitoring over time. But he was moving in the right direction, and Carol's job was to get him to the people who would manage the next part of it, and she kept her attention on that. Pete called a hold at a section where the drainage bank had slumped inward, narrowing the passable surface to something that required them to angle the sled carefully. He and Diane angled it without discussion, having worked out between them in the first 100 meters of the descent, the wordless coordination of two people doing a physical task that required both of them to have the same spatial understanding at the same time. Carol watched them and kept her attention on Alan, who was watching the same thing she was watching, with what appeared to be genuine interest. He said quietly, "They do this well." Carol said, "They're good at it." "You all are." A pause. "It shows." She did not deflect this. She said, "Thank you," because it was true, and because Pete and Diane deserved to have it said, even if they could not hear it from where they were, and because Alan had earned the right to say it. The drainage eased past the slumped section, and the going became cleaner again. They moved steadily. The wind was still absent in the shelter of the drainage walls, and Carol was grateful for this, in the specific way you were grateful for things in the field, not sentimentally but functionally, noting what was in your favor and using it. At the base of the drainage they transferred to the main trail, and the going became easier, the compacted surface giving the sled a cleaner path. They moved faster without the need to pick every step. Carol checked her watch. It was 4:15. In another hour the sky would begin to change, and the light would start to come, and the eastern range would shift from a place you navigated by headlamp to a place you could see, which was always a different kind of place. Alan would be in a warm vehicle before the light came. He would be in a hospital before the morning was fully established. His wife would see him today, Christmas Day, and the particular math of that was not something Carol had orchestrated, and was not something she thought too much about. But she was aware of it, in the way you are aware of a good thing, when it happens close to you. The ambulance had its rear doors open when they came out of the tree line, and Carol could see the interior lighting from 50 meters, warm and bright against the dark, the clean, functional warmth of medical equipment and heated space. She had delivered people to that kind of light before, and she always noticed it, the specific contrast of it against the mountain dark, the way it announced a different kind of care than the one she had been providing, the kind that took over from here. The trailhead appeared ahead of them, and with it the lights of the ambulance and the two paramedics who came forward to meet them, and Carol stepped back and let the handover happen the way it was supposed to happen, because her part in this specific chain was this specific link, and she did not need to be more than that. She stood at the edge of the trailhead parking area after the ambulance left, and let the cold settle around her. Pete was 3 feet to her right, eating the second half of a protein bar he had produced from his jacket pocket, which Carol strongly suspected he had been carrying since before they deployed, and which she regarded as the kind of preparation that distinguished people who did this work from people who merely thought they could. Diane was at the rear of Pete's vehicle, running through the post-operation gear check, the systematic and unhurried work of someone who understood that how you maintained your equipment was how you treated the next person who might need it. Carol's radio came through with dispatch confirming the medical handoff and closing the operational log for the Eastern Range case. She acknowledged. She heard the small administrative sound of a case being recorded as resolved, which was the quietest possible ending to the loudest kind of situation, and she had heard it enough times to understand that this quietness was exactly right. The work did not require ceremony. It required only that it get done, and that the person you came for got out. Diane said, without looking up from the gear check. How did you know the drainage was there? Carol had answered this question already tonight, up on the rock shelf with Alan, but she answered it again with the same economy. Found it by accident 2 years ago, went off trail and came back through it. Remembered the birch trees. Pete ate his protein bar. It's not in the operational notes. It's in the notes from a debrief. Not clearly enough. I'll write it up properly this time. Good, Pete said. This was the entire extent of his editorial comment, and it was sufficient. The thing needed to be done. She said she would do it. That was the end of it. She thought about this on the drive back, the specific obligation of writing it up properly. It was one of those pieces of the work that happened after the work, after the operation was closed, and the adrenaline of the field had settled, and the body was tired in the deep, productive way of a body that had been genuinely used. The documentation, the debriefs, the careful accumulation of detail that made the next operation slightly more possible than the one before it. She had never found this part of the work less important than any other part. She had found it less dramatic, which was not the same thing. The field knowledge that had let her find Alan tonight had come from exactly this kind of careful, unspectacular record-keeping, from someone noting a drainage on a training run and putting it somewhere it could be found. She owed that same thing to the people who would come after her on the Eastern Range. She thought about the documentation she would write in 2 days, not as obligation, but as something she was genuinely going to do carefully and completely. The way she did everything she valued. She was going to sit down with the operational map of the Eastern Range, and she was going to write the drainage approach in full, with coordinates for the entry between the birch trees, with notes on the conditions that made it preferable to the standard route, and the conditions under which it was not preferable, with a realistic estimate of the access time from the main trailhead and from the valley road. She was going to make it the kind of document that a person could pick up with no previous knowledge of the Eastern Range, and use, on a night like tonight, in conditions like these, and find their way to a rock shelf above a hollow in the face, and call a name into the dark and hear an answer. That was what the work asked of her right now. She was going to give it. She would write it up on the 27th when she was back on rotation. She would write it up completely. The drainage entry and the birch trees, and the distance from the main trail, and the conditions under which the approach was preferable to the standard route, and the conditions under which it was not. She would write it in the specific and usable language that made a piece of field documentation something a person could actually act on, rather than something they had to interpret. She would make it part of the record in the way it should have been 2 years ago. The valley road was still empty. The dark was still the thin, late dark of the last hour before light. She drove through it at a pace that was easy on the car, and easy on her, and let the road come to her steadily. She thought about Gary. She thought about Gary's office on the 23rd, the old coffee smell, and the pressed carpet, and his hands flat on the desk. She thought about what he had said, and the way he had said it, careful and prepared, because Gary was always careful and always prepared, and that was part of what made him a good commander. She had thanked him. She had walked to her car. She had sat in the driver's seat for a moment that she had not known at the time was the beginning of 2 days of the most difficult kind of stillness she had ever sat with. She did not feel that Gary had been wrong. She did not feel vindicated in the way that a smaller version of the situation might have suggested. What had happened tonight was not a rebuttal of Gary's decision. His decision was made on the information he had when he had it, and the information he had was correct as far as it went. She had needed rest. She had been running without adequate recovery for weeks. The protocol that governed rotation existed because people who did not rest eventually made the kind of mistakes that cost lives, and no one in the unit wanted to be responsible for that kind of mistake. What had happened tonight was not about the rotation. What had happened tonight was that the Eastern Range had needed someone who knew a particular drainage approach that was not adequately documented, and Carol knew it. And Carol had been 20 minutes from the trailhead when the call came. These two things were not in conversation with each other in the way that a story needed them to be. They were simply what was true. She had been available. She had known the way. She had gone. She thought, for a moment, about Gary getting the report on the 27th. She thought about his face when he read the details, the drainage, the approach, the resolution, when she did not think his face would carry any particular expression about the rotation. Gary did not operate in the register of having been right or wrong about individual decisions. He operated in the Register of Outcomes and Process, which was the correct register for a commander to operate in. When the outcome was good, the process had been sound. That was what the report would say, and that was what Gary would read, and that was all that needed to be true. She turned off the valley road onto the road that ran through her parents' neighborhood. The houses were dark and quiet in the way of a holiday morning before the world woke up to it, porch lights making small circles on snow that was undisturbed by footsteps. She had driven out of this neighborhood 2 hours and 18 minutes ago with 2:47 on the dashboard clock and a radio call that had not waited for the kettle to finish heating. Now she was driving back in. The neighborhood looked exactly as it had. It was possible that in every house she passed, the people sleeping in them would wake in a few hours to an ordinary Christmas, with no particular knowledge of or interest in what had moved through their streets in the early hours of the morning while they slept. This did not bother Carol. She had made peace with the invisibility of the work a long time ago. You did not do this kind of work for the recognition of people who were asleep when you needed to be out. You did it for the people who were not asleep, the people who were out in the cold with a locator beacon they were rationing, and a leg they could not walk on, and a decision they had made about not giving up. You did it for those people, and you did it because you were the person who knew the drainage and the birch trees, and you were 20 minutes from the trailhead. You did it because it was exactly what you were built to do, and no other reason was required. She turned into her parents' driveway and shut off the engine. The house was dark except for the living room window where the tree lights blinked in their uneven way. Still on, still going. Her mother had left them on when she went back to her armchair. Carol sat in the car for a moment and looked at those lights through the window and let them be what they were. Not a sign, not a metaphor, just lights on a tree that her mother had refused to replace for years because they were the ones that had been there every Christmas she could remember, and that was reason enough. She got out of the car. The cold met her face in a wave that was different from the mountain cold, gentler, familiar, the cold of the neighborhood she had grown up in, the cold of Christmas morning before the sun came up on it. She had felt this specific cold every year of her life. She knew it. She walked up the path to the front door and opened it quietly and stepped inside. The house was warm. It smelled like the tree, and like last night's dinner, and like the particular combination of things that made her parents' house itself, and not any other place in the world. She unzipped her jacket. She hung it on the hook by the door. She took off her boots and set them on the mat, next to the smaller boots her mother had put there when she came back inside from the night. She walked down the hall. Her mother was in the armchair in the living room. The blanket was over her legs, and Carol's cold, long-abandoned cup of tea was on the side table next to her. She was awake, or she was the version of awake that amounts to never having fully slept, her eyes finding Carol in the doorway the moment Carol appeared there. Carol said, "They found him." Her mother said, "I know." A pause. How was he? Cold, but alive. He kept the beacon going, rationed the battery across 3 days. He was careful, and he kept thinking clearly, and he stayed put when moving became more dangerous than staying. Her mother listened to this with the attention of a person who had been listening to these reports for 6 years and had learned what to hear in them. "He sounds like someone who wasn't going to be beaten by it," she said. "He wasn't." Her mother looked at Carol for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad they called you." Carol stood in the doorway. The tree lights blinked behind her mother, the uneven old ones that had been there every year. She let the words land, and she stood in them for a moment, without deflecting or minimizing or doing the thing she sometimes did, with things that mattered too much, the thing where she moved past them quickly, so they could not cost her anything. She said, "Me too." She went to the kitchen. The radio was on the counter. She set it next to her keys. She poured the cold tea down the sink, and rinsed the cup, and set it in the rack, and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the hill in the dark, which was not as dark as it had been. The east edge of the sky above the hill was different now. Lighter. Not light yet, but the place where light was going to come. A thin, pale announcement of the morning that was still some way off, but was no longer theoretical. Christmas morning. It was actually here now, no longer approaching but present, and she had been awake for all the hours that got it here. She thought about Alan in the ambulance. Warmer now, the blanket around him, the paramedics doing what paramedics do. She thought about the call his wife had received, the call that changed the weight of the entire world in the space of one sentence. She thought about the rock shelf and the hollow in the rock face, and Alan sitting in it with the locator device in both hands, rationing, waiting, refusing. She thought about his voice when she called his name from the ground below the shelf. Here. I'm here. 4 words. The most complete answer a person could give to the most important question. She had heard versions of it before, in other operations, on other slopes and in other conditions, and every time it arrived it was the same. Not thrilling, exactly. Not the surge of something sharp and bright that people from the outside sometimes imagined it would be. It was quieter than that, and more complete. It was the specific relief of a calculation that had resolved correctly after a long time of not knowing whether it would. She turned from the window and walked to her old bedroom. The room was the same room it had always been. The ceiling with its familiar crack above the window. The curtain making the same shape and the same light. The bed exactly where it had always been. The same bed she had slept in during every childhood illness and every holiday, and every night she had come back here over the years since she moved out. She lay down on it without changing, her clothes still carrying the cold of the mountain, in a way that would fade, the way cold always faded once you were somewhere warm long enough. She closed her eyes. She was tired in the proper way, the complete way, the way that only came from a body that had been asked for something real, and had given it fully, not the restless, unresolved tiredness of the night before, the tiredness of a person waiting for the moment they were built for. This was the other kind, the kind that came after. She thought about the drainage and the birch trees, and the way they had caught her headlamp at 30 meters in the dark, and resolved into exactly what she had remembered them as, unchanged from 2 years ago, exactly where she had left them in her memory, reliable in the way that certain things are reliable when you have given them the attention they deserve. She thought about Pete and the protein bar, and Diane and the gear check, and the 3 of them at the trailhead after the ambulance left, quiet, in the specific quiet of a team on the far side of something. She thought about the report she would write on the 27th, the drainage entry, the birch trees, the conditions, the grid reference, all of it, written out completely and clearly in the language that made a piece of operational knowledge usable by the next person who came to the Eastern Range and needed a way in that was not on the standard map. She thought about Gary reading it. She thought about Alan's wife, reading whatever Alan chose to tell her about the 3 days he had spent on the mountain. She thought about her mother in the armchair in the living room, awake through the night with the tea going cold on the side table, listening for the sound of the door. The ceiling was the same ceiling. The curtain held its shape. Outside her window, the world was becoming visible in the slow, unhurried way of a winter morning, the dark giving ground inch by inch to a light that was not bright or dramatic, but simply and completely the day arriving to replace the night. Carol breathed. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been exactly where she was supposed to be all night, in the chair by the window and in the car on the empty road, and on the mountain with her headlamp and her pack, and in the hollow in the rock with Alan. She had been exactly the person the night required, and the night had required exactly the person she was, and the 2 things had found each other the way they sometimes did when enough preparation and enough patience and enough time in the field had built the right person for the right moment. She did not think this made her special. She thought it made her lucky in the deepest sense of the word, the kind of luck that is really just the long consequence of having chosen correctly a long time ago, and having stayed with that choice through everything the choosing required. She had chosen this work, the work had built her. Tonight the building had mattered, in the most direct possible way. She did not need it to mean anything more than that. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was Christmas morning, and she had done what she was built to do, and a man named Alan was alive and warm, and on his way back to his wife, and the birch trees at the drainage entry were still there, for the next person who would need them. She slept.